The Montana wilderness holds no mercy for those unprepared to face its wrath, especially when winter descends with all its fury. For Eleanor Reed, a young widow with 3 tiny lives depending on her, that merciless landscape became both her greatest fear and the unlikely setting for a second chance at happiness. As the snow piles higher around her stranded wagon, with her triplets growing weaker by the hour, salvation arrives in the form of Mason Blackwell, a solitary rancher whose hardened heart finds itself thawing in the presence of 4 souls who need him more than they know. This is a tale of survival against impossible odds, of grief transformed into hope, and of how love can bloom in the harshest conditions when we least expect it. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Eleanor Reed clutched the worn leather journal to her chest, the last gift her husband Daniel had given her before pneumonia stole him from their lives 3 months ago. The bitter Montana wind howled outside the broken-down wagon, finding every crack and crevice to send icy fingers through. Outside, the world had disappeared into a swirling white void as the blizzard intensified. "Just a little longer, my darlings," she whispered, her breath visible in the frigid air as she leaned over the makeshift bed where her 3-month-old triplets lay bundled together. Abigail, the smallest, whimpered weakly, her tiny face pinched with cold, despite the extra blanket Eleanor had wrapped around her. Benjamin, always the strongest, had fallen unnaturally quiet, while Charlotte's labored breathing sent waves of terror through Eleanor's heart. The wagon had lost a wheel in a deep snowdrift 6 hours ago, sending their driver, Mr. Patterson, staggering off through knee-high snow to find help. That had been 4 hours ago, and Eleanor was losing hope that he would return. "Stay with me," she pleaded, gathering all 3 infants against her chest, trying to share what little warmth remained in her body. Her fingers, stiff and red from cold, fumbled with the blankets as she tucked them more securely around her children. The wagon creaked ominously as another gust of wind slammed against it. Eleanor closed her eyes, trying to remember the sunny April day when she and Daniel had stood on the porch of their small Pennsylvania home, dreaming of the future. They had been so full of hope then, despite the challenges of expecting their first child. 3 blessings instead of 1, Daniel had said, when the doctor announced they would have triplets, his grey eyes crinkling with joy and determination. As a skilled carpenter, he had immediately begun crafting a beautiful triple cradle, working late into the night after long days at his workshop. He never lived to see it finished or to hold his children. The winter had brought a deadly bout of pneumonia that took him in just 5 days, leaving Eleanor alone with 3 newborns and mounting debts. "Your father would be so proud of you," she murmured to her babies, rocking them gently as the cold seeped deeper into her bones. "So proud of how strong you've been." The letter from her cousin Harriet in Helena had seemed like salvation, a chance to start over, a home for her children, family to help shoulder the burden. The journey west had depleted the last of Eleanor's savings, but the promise of Harriet's support had made it worth the risk. Now, trapped in this merciless storm, miles from Helena, with night approaching, that decision felt like the height of foolishness. The triplets had been fed an hour ago, Eleanor having carefully rationed the last of their milk. The cold made them drowsy, which frightened her most of all. She knew enough about winter dangers to recognize that sleep in these conditions could be deadly. "Stay awake, little ones," she urged, gently rubbing Benjamin's cheeks when his eyes started to close. Just a little longer. Eleanor's own exhaustion threatened to overwhelm her. 3 months of sleepless nights, caring for the triplets alone, had drained her reserves even before this journey. Now, with hunger and cold sapping what strength remained, she fought to stay alert. The pocket watch that had belonged to Daniel lay open beside her, Nearly 6 o'clock. Darkness would soon be complete, and with it any remaining hope of rescue would fade. In desperation, Eleanor began to sing, her voice cracking with emotion and cold. "Hush, little babies, don't say a word. Mama's gonna buy you a mockingbird." Charlotte stirred at the sound, her tiny hand escaping the blanket to curl around Eleanor's finger. The simple gesture brought tears to Eleanor's eyes, crystallizing almost instantly in the bitter cold. "That's it, my sweet girl. Stay with Mama." A sudden sound outside the wagon made Eleanor freeze mid-verse. The muffled crunch of hooves in snow, growing closer. For a breathless moment, she wondered if her mind was playing tricks, manufacturing hope from desperation. "Hello," she called, her voice weak and raspy. "Is someone there? Please. We need help." The wagon door creaked open, letting in a blast of frigid air and a swirl of snowflakes. Eleanor curled protectively around her babies, squinting into the fading light. A massive silhouette filled the doorway, snow crusting a wide-brimmed hat and heavy sheepskin coat. For an instant, primal fear gripped Eleanor's heart. They were utterly at the mercy of whoever had found them. "Ma'am." The voice was deep, but gentle, tinged with concern. "Anybody hurt in here?" "My babies," Eleanor managed, her voice trembling. "They're so cold. We've been stranded for hours." The figure stepped inside, closing the door against the howling wind. As he removed his hat, Eleanor could make out a face, weathered by sun and wind, with piercing blue eyes that quickly assessed their situation. He appeared to be in his mid-30s, with dark hair dusted with snow and a strong, clean-shaven jaw set with determination. "Mason Blackwell," he introduced himself briefly, already shrugging out of his heavy coat. "My ranch is about 4 miles east of here." He draped the still warm coat over Eleanor and the triplets without hesitation, then knelt to examine the infants. With surprising gentleness. "They need warmth and shelter immediately," he said, his tone businesslike but not unkind. "And so do you, ma'am." "Eleanor Reed," she managed. "Our driver, Mr. Patterson, went for help hours ago." Mason nodded grimly. "Saw tracks heading north that have almost filled in. I'll send my men to look for him once we get you all to safety." His eyes lingered on the triplets. "3 little ones, all yours?" Eleanor nodded, feeling tears threaten again at the simple kindness in his voice. "Triplets, 3 months old, Abigail, Benjamin, and Charlotte." Something flickered in Mason's eyes, surprise and perhaps a deeper emotion, before his practical nature reasserted itself. "My horse can carry us all, but it'll be a cold ride. I've got blankets in my saddlebags, and we'll wrap the little ones between us for warmth." Eleanor hesitated, glancing around the wagon that held everything she owned in the world. "My belongings?" "I'll send men back for them tomorrow," Mason assured her, already gathering up the children's meager supplies. "Right now, saving these. Babies is all that matters." The simple truth of his words steeled Eleanor's resolve. Possessions could be replaced. Her children could not. With efficient movements that bespoke years of frontier life, Mason helped Eleanor secure the triplets in makeshift slings against her body, then wrapped them all in blankets pulled from his saddlebags. The preparations. It took only minutes, but to Eleanor it felt like precious time slipping away as her babies grew colder. "Ready?" Mason asked, his breath clouding in the frigid air. Eleanor nodded, though in truth she wondered if she had the strength to make the journey. Her legs felt leaden, and a dangerous drowsiness pulled at her mind. Mason seemed to recognize her condition. Without comment, he lifted Eleanor and the triplets into his arms, as if they weighed nothing, carrying them through the snow to where his horse waited, a magnificent black stallion that stood stoically against the driving snow. "This is Thunder," Mason said, settling Eleanor sideways in the saddle before mounting behind her. "Best horse in the territory. He'll get us home." Eleanor felt herself enveloped in Mason's solid warmth as his arms came around her to take the reins. The triplets were nestled securely between them, protected from the worst of the wind and cold. "Hold on," he instructed, his voice close to her ear. "And stay awake, Mrs. Reed. Talk to me about your little ones." As thunder began moving steadily through the deepening snow, Eleanor found herself fighting the treacherous pull of sleep. Mason's prompt penetrated her foggy mind. "Benjamin was born first," she said, her voice barely audible above the wind. "Already strong-willed, just like his father. Charlotte came next, quiet but alert, and little Abigail was last. So tiny the doctor wasn't sure she'd survive the night. But she did," Mason observed, guiding his horse around a drift with expert precision. "She's a fighter," Eleanor agreed, feeling a surge of maternal pride that momentarily burned through her exhaustion. "They all are." "Like their mother," Mason said, the simple acknowledgement of her strength bringing unexpected tears to Eleanor's eyes. The journey seemed endless, the landscape an undifferentiated white blur in the fading light. Mason kept Eleanor talking, asking about her destination, her journey from Pennsylvania, anything to keep her mind active. When her responses became slurred and infrequent, he started telling her about his ranch instead. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "Nearly 2,000 acres of the best grazing land in the territory," he said, his deep voice rumbling against her back. "Started with nothing but a claim and 20 heads of cattle 8 years ago. Built every structure with my own hands." Through her haze of cold and exhaustion, Eleanor noted the pride in his voice. "You live there alone?" she managed to ask. A brief silence followed before Mason answered. "Just me and my ranch hands these days. My wife, Rebecca, passed away 4 years ago. Fever took her quick." "I'm sorry," Eleanor murmured, understanding all too well the hollow ache of such loss. Mason didn't respond except to tighten his arms slightly around her and the babies. They rode in silence for a time, save for the sound of thunder's labored breathing and the constant moan of the wind. Just as Eleanor felt she couldn't stay conscious any longer, Mason's voice broke through her mental fog. "There it is. Look ahead." Eleanor forced her eyes open to see golden light glimmering through the snow, growing stronger as they approached. Gradually, the silhouette of a substantial ranch house emerged from the whiteness, smoke curling from its chimney into the darkening sky. "Home," Mason said simply, guiding Thunder toward the barn that loomed nearby. As they drew closer, Eleanor could make out other buildings scattered across the property. A bunkhouse, various outbuildings, corrals and fences, all speaking of prosperity and permanence. The ranch house itself was larger than she had expected, built of solid timber with a wide porch wrapping around its front. Mason dismounted first, then reached up to carefully lift Eleanor and the triplets. Her legs buckled as soon as her feet touched the ground, but Mason's strong arms caught her. "Easy now," he said, his expression concerned as he noted her weakness. Without hesitation, he swept her up, babies and all, and carried them toward the house. Through her exhaustion, Eleanor felt a wave of gratitude so powerful it brought fresh tears to her eyes. "The horse," she murmured, remembering the noble animal that had brought them through the storm. "My foreman will see to Thunder," Mason assured her as the front door opened, spilling light and warmth into the snowy night. A middle-aged woman with silver streaks, dark hair, stood in the doorway, her eyes widening at the sight of them. "Mrs. Hathaway," Mason called over the wind, "we need warm blankets, hot water, and whatever milk we have in the spring house. This is Mrs. Reed and her babies. They've been stranded in the storm." The housekeeper stepped aside to let them enter, already moving efficiently to carry out Mason's requests. "The guest room is ready, Mr. Blackwell. I'll stoke the fire higher." The sudden warmth of the house struck Eleanor like a physical blow after so many hours in the bitter cold. The large main room was dominated by a massive stone fireplace where a fire blazed cheerfully. Comfortable furniture was arranged around it, creating an inviting space that spoke of both practicality and comfort. Mason carried Eleanor directly to the hearth, settling her gently on a sofa drawn close to the fire. "Let's get these little ones warm first," he said, already helping her unwrap the triplets from their cocoon of blankets. To Eleanor's immense relief, all three babies were still alive, though their small bodies felt alarmingly cool to the touch. Benjamin began to cry weakly as the warmth reached him, the sound both heartbreaking and hopeful. Mrs. Hathaway returned with an armload of blankets and a determined expression. "Let me help with the little ones, Ma'am," she said, her capable hands already reaching for Abigail, the smallest. Eleanor's maternal instinct made her hesitate, reluctant to relinquish her children to a stranger despite her own exhaustion. Mason seemed to understand. "Mrs. Hathaway raised 5 children of her own," he said quietly, "and her youngest grandbaby is only 6 months old. Your little ones couldn't be in better hands while you rest." The simple assurance, combined with Eleanor's bone-deep exhaustion, was enough. She allowed the housekeeper to take Abigail, watching as the woman expertly checked the infant's condition. "This one needs warming slowly," Mrs. Hathaway pronounced. "I'll wrap her in a blanket that's just warm, not hot. Shock to the system otherwise." Eleanor nodded gratefully, recognizing the wisdom of experience in the woman's words. Charlotte and Benjamin were soon similarly tended to, their cries growing stronger as circulation returned to their tiny limbs. As the immediate crisis of the triplets' condition began to ease, Eleanor felt her own strength failing completely. The room swam before her eyes, and she swayed where she sat. "Mrs. Reed?" Mason's concerned voice seemed to come from a great distance. "Eleanor?" The use of her given name registered dimly as darkness closed in around her vision. She was aware of strong arms catching her as she slumped forward, and then nothing at all. When Eleanor next opened her eyes, she found herself in an unfamiliar bedroom, tucked under heavy quilts in a 4-poster bed. A fire crackled in a small hearth across the room, and a lamp burned low on a bedside table. For a moment, disorientation gripped her. Then memory flooded back, bringing with it a surge of panic. "My babies!" she gasped, struggling to sit up. "They're right here, ma'am," came Mrs. Hathaway's steady voice from a rocking chair near the fire, all fed and sleeping peacefully. Eleanor turned to see a large cradle placed near the bed, close enough that she could reach out and touch it. Inside, the triplets slept side by side, their faces peaceful in the firelight, each wrapped in a soft blanket. Relief made her dizzy, and she sank back against the pillows. "How long have I been asleep?" "Nearly 6 hours," Mrs. Hathaway replied, rising to approach the bed. "You were half frozen and exhausted." Mr. Blackwell was quite concerned. Eleanor flushed, remembering how the rancher had carried her and her children through the blizzard. "I need to thank him." "There'll be time for that come morning," the housekeeper said firmly, picking up a mug from the bedside table. "For now, drink this broth. You need your strength, especially if you're nursing these little ones." The rich smell of chicken broth made Eleanor's stomach clench with sudden hunger. She accepted the mug gratefully, taking a cautious sip of the warm liquid. "The babies?" she began anxiously. "You said they've been fed." Mrs. Hathaway nodded. "Found some goat's milk in the spring house. Not what they're used to, I expect, but it'll do for now." "The little girl, Abigail?" "She was struggling a bit, but she's taken some milk and seems stronger now." Eleanor's eyes filled with tears of gratitude. "I don't know how to thank you. If you hadn't found us—" "Best not to dwell on what might have been," Mrs. Hathaway interrupted practically. "Mr. Blackwell has a knack for being where he's needed. Providence, some might call it." As if summoned by the mention of his name, a soft knock sounded at the door, and Mason himself entered, carrying a tray with more food. "Mrs. Reed," he said, his expression lightening with relief when he saw her awake. "How are you feeling?" "Better," Eleanor managed, suddenly conscious of her disheveled appearance, and the fact that she was in this stranger's home, dependent on his charity. "Mr. Blackwell, I can never repay what you've done for us today." "No repayment necessary," he said firmly, setting the tray on a small table. Any decent person would have done the same. But they both knew that wasn't entirely true. Many might have passed by a stranded wagon in such a dangerous storm, prioritizing their own safety. Many more would have balked at the responsibility. "Of 3 infants, your driver, Mr. Patterson," Mason continued, his expression grave. "My men found him about 2 miles north of where your wagon broke down. He'd taken shelter in a stand of pines, but was badly frostbitten." Eleanor's hand flew to her mouth. "Will he recover?" "Doc Tucker's with him now in the bunkhouse." "He's hopeful." "But Mason left the sentence unfinished, his meaning clear. The news sobered Eleanor further. Mr. Patterson had been kind throughout their journey west, speaking often of his own grandchildren back in Illinois. The thought that his desire to find help for them might cost him so dearly was another burden on her conscience. "The storm's still raging," Mason added, moving to look out the window where snow lashed against the glass. "Likely will for another day at least. You and your little ones are welcome to stay until it's safe to travel on." "Thank you," Eleanor said, the simple words inadequate for the depth of her gratitude. "I had hoped to reach my cousin in Helena before nightfall." "Helena's still a good 30 miles from here," Mason observed. "Even in fair weather, that's a challenging journey with 3 infants." The gentle observation held no judgment, but Eleanor felt the weight of her decision anew. Had she been foolish to attempt such a journey with the triplets, especially as winter approached? Daniel would have been more cautious, more prepared. As if sensing her thoughts, Mason added, "You're welcome to send word to your cousin once the trail's clear. Let her know you're safe." Abigail stirred in the cradle, her tiny whimper quickly building toward a full cry. Without thinking, Eleanor moved to rise, but Mason was already there, reaching into the cradle with surprising confidence to lift the smallest triplet. "Hello there, little one," he said softly, cradling Abigail against his broad chest. "Found your voice again, have you?" Eleanor watched in astonishment as her normally fussy daughter quieted almost immediately, regarding Mason with solemn eyes. "Do you have experience with babies?" She couldn't help asking. A shadow passed over Mason's face. "My sister lived here, with her children for a time after Rebecca passed. Her youngest was just a babe then." He gently transferred Abigail to Eleanor's waiting arms. "I'll leave you to tend to them. Mrs. Hathaway will be nearby if you need anything during the night." He was almost to the door when Eleanor called after him, "Mr. Blackwell." He turned, his expression questioning. "Thank you," she said simply. "For saving my children's lives, for saving mine." Mason nodded once, his blue eyes holding hers for a moment. "Get some rest, Mrs. Reed. Tomorrow's soon enough to worry about what comes next." As he closed the door behind him, Eleanor looked down. At Abigail's face, then at Benjamin and Charlotte still sleeping peacefully in the cradle. Against all odds, they had survived the day. What tomorrow would bring she couldn't know, but for tonight at least they were safe, warm, and cared for. Outside the blizzard raged on, but its fury seemed distant now, unable to touch them in this unexpected sanctuary. Eleanor settled back against the pillows, with Abigail nestled against her heart, listening to the comforting crackling of the fire and the steady breathing of her children. For the first time since Daniel's death, she allowed herself to feel something beyond grief and worry, a cautious glimmer of hope. Morning arrived, with brilliant sunlight streaming through frost-covered windows, the storm having spent its fury during the night. Eleanor woke to the unfamiliar sound of someone moving quietly around the room. Mrs. Hathaway was already tending to Benjamin, who was fussing softly in the cradle. "Good morning, Mrs. Reed," the housekeeper said with a warm smile. The little Gentleman here was just letting me know he's ready for breakfast. Eleanor sat up, momentarily disoriented by the unfamiliar surroundings before yesterday's events rushed back. "Have they been awake long?" she asked, reaching for her daughter Charlotte, who was beginning to stir. "Just this one," Mrs. Hathaway replied, expertly cradling Benjamin. "The girls seem content to sleep a bit longer, though I suspect not for much longer." Eleanor nodded, grateful that her babies appeared to have suffered no ill effects from their dangerous exposure to the cold. "Mr. Patterson? How is he this morning?" Mrs. Hathaway's expression sobered. "Doc Tucker's still with him. The frostbites. Bad, especially on his hands and feet, but he's young and strong. There's hope." The news brought a fresh wave of guilt. If not for Eleanor's decision to press on despite the threatening weather, the driver wouldn't be fighting for his life. As if sensing her thoughts, Mrs. Hathaway added firmly, "That storm came on faster than anyone expected. The best weather prophets in the territory were caught off guard by it." A knock at the door interrupted them. Mason entered, carrying a tray, laden with breakfast, and a small pitcher of what Eleanor assumed was more goat's milk for the triplets. "Morning," he said. His deep voice softened as he noticed the sleeping infants. He set the tray on the small table by the window. "Thought you might be hungry." "Thank you," Eleanor responded, suddenly conscious of her appearance. She'd slept in her clothes, and her long auburn hair had come loose from its pins during the journey. She tucked a stray strand behind her ear, feeling strangely self-conscious under Mason's clear gaze. "The storm's passed," he continued, moving to stand by the window. "Left nearly 3 feet of snow behind it, but the sky's clear now. I've sent word to Helena about your delay." Eleanor's eyes widened. "Already? But how—" "Jimmy rode out at first light," Mason explained. "Best rider I have. If anyone can get through these conditions, it's him. Your cousin should know by nightfall that you're safe." The thoughtfulness of the gesture touched Eleanor deeply. "You've been so kind, Mr. Blackwell. I don't know how we can ever repay you." Mason's expression remained impassive, but his eyes softened. "No repayment necessary, Mrs. Reed. Your little ones are looking stronger this morning." "Thanks to you." "And Mrs. Hathaway," Eleanor acknowledged, meeting his gaze steadily. In the clear morning light, she could see Mason better than she had during the chaos of their rescue. He was younger than she'd first thought, perhaps 35, with those striking blue eyes set in a face weathered by sun and wind. His dark hair was neatly trimmed, though a bit too long by Eastern standards, curling slightly where it touched his collar. "Your belongings should arrive from the wagon by midday," Mason continued, breaking the momentary silence. "My men left at dawn to salvage what they could." Eleanor felt a surge of gratitude. "That's more than I could have hoped for. I feared everything was lost." "Weather's harsh enough out here without losing what little you've brought with you," Mason said pragmatically. He hesitated, then added, "I understand you're bound for your cousins in Helena?" Eleanor nodded, shifting Charlotte to her other arm as the baby began to fuss. "Harriet's the only family I have left since my husband passed. She's offered us a home until I can establish myself." Mason watched as she soothed Charlotte, his expression thoughtful. "It's not easy raising children alone, especially 3. "No," Eleanor admitted softly. "It's not what I expected, but—" She trailed off, looking down at Charlotte's tiny face. "They're all I have left of him." The simple statement hung in the air between them, an acknowledgement of the grief they both carried. "Well," Mason said finally, "you're welcome to stay until the trails are clear enough for safe travel. Could be a week or more, given the depth of snow." Before Eleanor could respond, Benjamin let out a lusty cry, clearly tired of waiting for attention. The sound triggered Abigail, who joined the chorus from the cradle. The corner of Mason's mouth twitched in what might have been a suppressed smile. "I'll leave you to tend to your audience, Mrs. Reed. Mrs. Hathaway will see to anything you need." With a brief nod, he departed, leaving Eleanor to the demanding task of feeding and changing 3 hungry infants. Mrs. Hathaway proved an invaluable ally, her experienced hands making quick work of tasks that would have taken Eleanor 3 times as long alone. "Mr. Blackwell is a good man," the housekeeper commented as they worked side by side. "Better than most would be, taking in a stranger with 3 babies in the dead of winter." Eleanor glanced at the older woman, detecting something unspoken in her tone. "He seems very capable." Mrs. Hathaway nodded approvingly. "Built this ranch from nothing but wilderness and determination. Works harder than any 3 men put together." She hesitated, then added more quietly, "Been lonely since Miss Rebecca passed. Throws himself into his work like it's all that matters." The revelation that Mason's grief might be as fresh as her own surprised Eleanor. 4 years seemed a long time to mourn, yet she couldn't imagine the day when Daniel's absence wouldn't ache like an open wound. Were they married long? She found herself asking. 3 years, Mrs. Hathaway replied, expertly swaddling Abigail, just long enough to build this house and start dreaming of filling it with children. Eleanor's heart constricted at the thought. No children of their own, then? A shadow crossed the housekeeper's face. Almost. Miss Rebecca was expecting when the fever took her, lost them both in the same night. The tragedy was almost too painful to contemplate. Eleanor instinctively held Benjamin closer, unable to imagine the devastation of such a double loss. "He doesn't speak of it," Mrs. Hathaway continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "Not once in 4 years. But I see how he watches your little ones, Mrs. Reed, like a man dying of thirst, looking at water he can't drink." The frank assessment startled Eleanor. Before she could respond, boots sounded in the hallway, and the conversation shifted to more practical matters. By mid-afternoon, Eleanor felt strong enough to leave the bedroom. With Mrs. Hathaway's help, she dressed in clean clothes from her recovered trunk, brushed her hair into a simple knot at the nape of her neck, and prepared to face her host properly. The main room of the ranch house was larger than she'd realized. The night before, with high ceilings and generous windows that filled the space with winter light. A massive stone fireplace dominated one wall, while bookshelves lined another, filled with volumes that spoke of a mind hungrier for knowledge than one might expect from a frontier rancher. Eleanor settled the triplets in a nest of blankets near the fire, marveling at how much stronger they seemed after just one night of proper rest and care. Even tiny Abigail was more alert, her dark eyes tracking movement with newborn curiosity. "They're resilient little things," came Mason's voice from the doorway. Eleanor turned to find him watching them, his tall frame silhouetted against the bright snow visible through the windows behind him. "Yes," she agreed with her mother's pride. "They've faced more in their 3 months than most do in years. Sometimes I think they're stronger than I am." Mason stepped fully into the room, removing his hat and gloves. The scent of cold, clean air clung to him, along with the faint smell of horses and leather. "Just spoke with Doc Tucker," he said, his expression serious. "Patterson's awake and asking for you. Worried sick about what happened to you and the little ones." Relief flooded through Eleanor. "Will he recover?" "Lost 2 fingers to frostbite, and he'll need time to heal. But he'll live," Mason confirmed. "Doc says he can have visitors if you're feeling up to it." Eleanor glanced at the triplets, hesitant to leave them. "I'll stay with them," Mrs. Hathaway offered, emerging from the kitchen with perfect timing. "You can ease that poor man's mind." With a grateful nod, Eleanor wrapped herself in a borrowed shawl and followed Mason outside. The cold hit her like a physical blow after the warmth of the house, but the day was stunningly beautiful, the snow-covered landscape glittering under a flawless blue sky. "It's breathtaking," she murmured, momentarily forgetting the purpose of their errand as she took in the panoramic view of mountains rising beyond snow-blanketed plains. "Different from Pennsylvania, I'd imagine," Mason commented, offering his arm as they negotiated a path cleared through snow nearly waist-high. "Entirely," Eleanor agreed, accepting his support gratefully. "We had snow, of course, but nothing this vast, this overwhelming." "Montana's not for the faint of heart," Mason acknowledged, guiding her toward a long, low building some 50 yards from the main house. "But she rewards those who learn her ways. You sound like you love it here. Can't imagine living anywhere else now," he admitted. "Tried city life back in St. Louis after the war. Felt like I couldn't breathe." Eleanor studied his profile, intrigued by this glimpse into his past. "You fought in the war?" A shadow crossed his face. "Union cavalry, 4 years that aged me 20. He shook his head slightly, as if dispelling unwelcome memories. "The war's what brought me west. Needed open spaces and honest work after all that bloodshed." They had reached the bunkhouse door. Mason paused, his expression softening. "Patterson's badly shaken. Blames himself for what happened to you and the little ones." "But it wasn't his fault," Eleanor protested. "The wheel broke. There was nothing he could have done. He knows that here." Mason tapped his forehead. "But not here." He placed his hand over his heart. "Man feels responsible for those in his care. It's not always rational." The insight revealed. More about Mason himself than about Mr. Patterson, Eleanor suspected. Before she could respond, he opened the door, ushering her into the relative warmth of the bunkhouse. The long room was simply furnished with bunks along both walls, a large table in the center, and a pot-bellied stove radiating heat at the far end. Near the stove, a makeshift sickbed had been arranged, where Mr. Patterson lay propped up on pillows, his hands swathed in bandages. "Mrs. Reed!" he exclaimed when he saw her, relief washing over his haggard face. "Thank God. The babies, all safe and well," Eleanor assured him, moving quickly to his bedside. "Thanks to your bravery in seeking help and Mr. Blackwell's timely arrival." The driver's eyes filled with tears. "When I couldn't find the road in that whiteout, I thought I'd killed you all." "You did exactly right," Mason interjected firmly from behind Eleanor. "Found shelter when you realized you were lost, instead of wandering until you froze. That's why you're alive to tell me about it." Mr. Patterson nodded weakly, but his gaze remained troubled. "Your cousin and Helena will be frantic, Mrs. Reed. We're nearly 3 days late." "Mr. Blackwell has already sent word," Eleanor assured him, patting his arm gently. "Harriet will know we're safe by this evening." The driver's eyes widened, shooting a look of gratitude toward Mason. "You're a good man, Mr. Blackwell. Not many would ride out after such a storm." Mason merely nodded, clearly uncomfortable with the praise. "Rest now. Doc says you need it." They stayed only a few minutes longer, Eleanor promising to visit again the next day. As they walked back toward the main house, she found herself studying Mason with new eyes, seeing beyond the capable rancher to the man beneath. "You were a cavalry officer?" she asked, noticing the straight-backed way he carried himself, the instinctive alertness in his gaze as it swept the horizon. Mason's eyebrows rose slightly at her perception. "Captain, though that life seems like a dream now, and after the war you came directly west." "Not immediately." His voice took on a carefully neutral tone. "Tried settling back in Missouri first. Met Rebecca there. Her father owned the general store in our town." Eleanor sensed there was more to the story, but his closed expression warned against further questions. Instead, she asked, "Have you always been a rancher?" At this, Mason's face relaxed somewhat. "My father raised horses before the war. I grew up learning the trade. Cattle came later once I claimed this land." They had reached the house, and Mason held the door for her, the gesture automatic but gentlemanly. Inside, Mrs. Hathaway was rocking Charlotte, while Abigail and Benjamin slept peacefully in their improvised bed. No trouble at all, the housekeeper reported with a smile that suggested she'd enjoyed her time with the infants. Though this little lady seems to have a preference for movement, Eleanor laughed softly, recognizing Charlotte's tendency to settle only when being rocked or carried. She's been that way since birth. Daniel used to say she'd be running before she crawled. The mention of her late husband brought a familiar pang, but for once it was tempered by the warm scene before her. Mrs. Hathaway rocking her daughter, Benjamin and Abigail sleeping safely, the solid presence of Mason Blackwell behind her, all created a tableau of domestic tranquility she hadn't experienced since Daniel's death. "I should check on the afternoon feeding," Mason said, seeming almost reluctant to leave. "The hands will be bringing in the last of your belongings soon." After he departed, Mrs. Hathaway gave Eleanor a knowing look. "He's been in and out all day, checking on the little ones, trying to make it seem like he just happened to be passing by." Eleanor felt a blush rise to her cheeks. "He's been very kind." "Kindness and something more," the housekeeper observed shrewdly. "Seen him with plenty of visitors over the years. Never knew him to personally ride out in a blizzard for any of them." "He would have done the same for anyone in our situation," Eleanor protested, though she wasn't entirely convinced. Mrs. Hathaway merely smiled. "Perhaps, but I haven't seen him look at anyone the way he looks at you and those babies since Miss Rebecca was alive." The observation left Eleanor flustered and uncertain. She was still raw with grief for Daniel, still adjusting to life without him. The idea that Mason Blackwell might see her as anything more than a woman in need of assistance was unsettling, yet strangely warming. The remainder of the day passed in a comfortable routine of caring for the triplets, settling into their temporary quarters, and sharing a simple but hearty supper with Mason and Mrs. Hathaway. To Eleanor's surprise, Mason proved to be both educated and well-read, discussing everything from current affairs to literature with thoughtful intelligence. "You're surprised?" he observed during a lull in the conversation, his perceptive gaze catching her expression. Eleanor felt herself blush again. "I didn't expect, that is, you didn't expect a rancher to have read Emerson or to have opinions on the territorial governor's policies," he finished for her, not unkindly. "Most don't, I'll grant you that." "I'm sorry," she said contritely. "That was presumptuous of me." Mason's expression softened. "Not at all. I've cultivated certain expectations about how a rancher should appear to outsiders. It's easier that way." "Easier?" He hesitated, as if weighing how much to reveal. "People expect a certain type out here. Meet those expectations, and they leave you to your own devices. It's simpler." The statement revealed volumes about the man. Behind the capable, somewhat taciturn rancher was a complex individual who deliberately maintained distance between himself and others. And Eleanor wondered what experiences had taught him such caution. After supper, as Mrs. Hathaway cleared the dishes, Mason surprised Eleanor by asking, "Would you like to see the workshop? I've been carving a new cradle that might serve your three." "Better than that makeshift arrangement." Touched by the offer, Eleanor nodded. "I'd like that very much." Mrs. Hathaway volunteered to listen for the triplets, who were sleeping peacefully after their evening feeding. Mason led Eleanor through a door off the main room into what had clearly once been intended as a formal dining room, but had been converted to a woodworking shop. The space was organized with military precision, tools hanging on the walls in careful arrangements, work surfaces clean and orderly. In the center stood a cradle large enough to hold all three triplets comfortably, its construction nearly complete. "It's beautiful," Eleanor breathed, running her fingers over the smooth wood. The cradle was a work of art, with delicate carvings of woodland animals encircling its sides. "Just needs finishing," Mason said, but she could hear the pride in his voice. "Thought your three might sleep better together, since they're used to it." "You made this today?" Eleanor asked incredulously, noting the intricate detail work that must have taken hours. Mason shook his head. "Been working on it off and on for a while now. Never knew who it was for, just felt compelled to make it." Yes, a revelation that he had been creating this beautiful piece without a specific recipient in mind touched Eleanor deeply. "It's the most thoughtful gift anyone has ever offered us." In the soft lamplight, Mason's expression was difficult to read. "Not much use to me otherwise," he said quietly. "Never thought I'd see children using it here." The simple statement carried such profound sorrow that Eleanor acted on instinct, laying her hand gently on his arm. "I'm so sorry about your wife, Mason, and your child." He stiffened slightly at the direct reference, but didn't pull away. "Been a long time now." "Grief doesn't always keep time the way we expect," Eleanor said softly, thinking of her own still raw loss. "Some days it feels like yesterday." Mason's eyes met hers, recognition passing between them. The understanding that only those who have known such loss can truly share. "Mrs. Hathaway told you?" he asked finally. Eleanor nodded. "She thought I should know. I hope you don't mind." "No," he said after a moment. "No, I don't mind you knowing." He ran his hand along the cradle's edge. "Rebecca would have liked you. She had that same directness, that same strength I see in you." The comparison to a woman he had clearly loved deeply felt like an unexpected honor. "I wish I could have known her." "So do I," Mason said simply. He stepped back slightly, breaking the moment of intimacy. "I'll have this finished by tomorrow. Your little ones deserve better than a drawer, no matter how well padded." "Thank you," Eleanor said, understanding that he needed space. Not just for the cradle, but for everything. As they walked back to the main room, Eleanor felt a subtle shift in their relationship. Something had changed in that quiet workshop. A barrier lowered, a connection formed through shared experience of loss and the tentative hope of healing. Outside, night had fallen, turning the snow-covered landscape into a sea of silver under the rising moon. Inside, the ranch house felt increasingly like a haven, not just from the physical dangers of winter, but from the emotional isolation Eleanor had endured since Daniel's death. For the first time in months, she didn't feel entirely alone. And that, perhaps, was the most unexpected gift of all. The next week passed in a blur of routine and discovery as Eleanor and the triplets adjusted to life at Blackwell Ranch. Each day brought new appreciation for the carefully ordered world Mason had built. The ranch operated with the precision of a well-oiled machine, every ranch hand knowing their responsibilities, every task completed with efficient care. By the 5th day, a letter arrived from Harriet in Helena, carried by a weather-beaten courier who seemed unfazed by the treacherous winter trails. "Your cousin sounds mighty relieved," Mrs. Hathaway observed, as Eleanor read the letter aloud over breakfast, "though not exactly eager to brave the snow herself to fetch you." Eleanor folded the letter carefully, her expression thoughtful. Harriet was never one for adventure. She made that quite clear when she wrote that I should wait until spring to make the journey west. "Sensible advice," Mason commented, accepting a cup of coffee from Mrs. Hathaway. "Though I understand why you couldn't." Wait, he did understand, Eleanor realized. Unlike her relatives back east, who had viewed her decision to travel with 3 infants as reckless, Mason grasped the desperation that had driven her west. With Daniel gone and creditors circling, waiting for spring had simply not been an option. "She's invited us to continue on to Helena as soon as the trail's clear," Eleanor said, tucking the letter into her pocket. "Mr. Patterson should be well enough to travel in another week or 2, according to Dr. Tucker." Something flickered in Mason's eyes, disappointment perhaps, before he nodded. "We'll make sure you have a proper escort when the time comes. The trail to Helena can be dangerous even in good weather." "Thank you," Eleanor murmured, surprised by her own reluctance at the thought of leaving the ranch. In just 5 days, the place had begun to feel familiar, even welcoming. Mrs. Hathaway's motherly presence, the comfortable routines they'd established with the triplets, and Mason's quiet strength had created a sense of security she hadn't felt. Since before Daniel's illness, after breakfast, Eleanor found herself drawn to the large bay window in the main room, watching Mason work with a spirited young horse in the corral. His patience with the nervous animal was remarkable, his movements calm and deliberate as he gradually earned its trust. "He has a way with creatures that fear," Mrs. Hathaway observed, joining Eleanor at the window. "Always has." "Did he train horses before the cattle ranch?" Eleanor asked, fascinated by the almost mesmerizing rhythm of man and animal moving together in the snow-covered corral. "His first love, before Rebecca even," the housekeeper confirmed. "The cattle came after, when he realized there was more profit in beef than horses in these parts." Eleanor watched as the young horse finally allowed Mason to stroke its neck. The animal's initial fear transformed into cautious acceptance. She couldn't help drawing parallels to her own situation, a wary widow gradually lowering her guard in response to consistent kindness. "He's offered to show me the full operation of the ranch today," Eleanor said, somewhat hesitant. "If you wouldn't mind watching the triplets for a few hours?" Mrs. Hathaway's eyes lit with approval. "I'd be delighted to have them to myself for a spell. That Benjamin is developing quite a personality reminds me of my youngest grandson." Eleanor smiled, grateful yet again for the housekeeper's willingness to help with the triplets. Without her assistance, Eleanor would have been confined to the house, unable to explore the ranch that was becoming increasingly intriguing to her. An hour later, bundled in a borrowed coat, scarf, and gloves that were far more suitable for Montana, winter than her eastern garments, Eleanor joined Mason by the stables. He had saddled 2 horses, a gentle-looking bay mare for her and his own stallion, Thunder. "Have you ridden before?" he asked, eyeing her with mild concern. "Some, though not recently," Eleanor admitted. "My father kept horses when I was a girl." Mason nodded, offering his cupped hands to help her mount. "Belle here is steady as they. Come, she'll take good care of you." The mare stood patiently as Eleanor settled herself in the saddle, adjusting her skirts as best she could. She'd never ridden astride before, having been taught the more ladylike side saddle position in her youth, but the straight saddle felt surprisingly secure. "Ready?" Mason asked, swinging easily onto Thunder's back. Eleanor nodded, determination, overcome her initial nervousness. "Show me your world, Mr. Blackwell." His smile was unexpected and transformative, erasing years from his weathered face. "Mason," he corrected gently. "If we're to spend the day together, I think we can dispense with formalities." "Mason," she repeated, returning his smile, "and I'm Eleanor." They rode at a leisurely pace, Mason pointing out landmarks and explaining the operation of the ranch. What had appeared to Eleanor as an undifferentiated expanse of snow-covered terrain revealed itself as a carefully planned enterprise, with specific areas designated for different purposes. "Creek runs through there," Mason indicated a slight depression in the landscape. "Come spring, that whole meadow will green up first. Best grazing on the property." "How many cattle do you run?" Eleanor asked, genuinely interested in understanding the scale of his operation. "Nearly 2,000 heads now," he replied with quiet pride. "Started with just 20. Every year we've built the herd, improved the bloodlines." He pointed to a distant group of outbuildings. "That's where we do the calving in spring. Built those barns myself, my first winter here. Alone." Eleanor couldn't imagine the labor involved. Mason's expression grew distant. "Had a partner at first. My best friend from the war, Will Tucker, the doc's brother. We started the ranch together." His voice took on a somber note. "Lost him in a flash flood that second year, trying to save a group of stranded calves. Another loss in this man's life, Eleanor thought sadly. I'm sorry. Mason adjusted his hat, brushing off the sympathy with practiced ease. It's ranch life, beautiful but harsh. You learn to take the bitter with the sweet. They continued their tour, cresting a small rise that afforded a panoramic view of the entire property. In the clear winter light, Eleanor could see why Mason had chosen this valley. Sheltered by distant mountains, yet open enough for expansive grazing, the location was both practical and stunningly beautiful. It's breathtaking, she said softly. Rebecca said the same thing the first time I brought her here, Mason replied, his voice gentler now. Said she could see all the way to forever from this spot. The mention of his late wife no longer seemed to pain him as much, Eleanor noticed. Perhaps sharing memories was helping heal that old wound. Daniel always wanted land, she found herself saying. Not a ranch, but a place in the country where he could practice medicine without the city's distractions. Somewhere our children could run free. The memory brought a bittersweet smile. He never expected 3 at once, though. Mason chuckled. The sound surprisingly youthful. Can't imagine anyone does. Must have been quite the shock. The doctor's face when he told us, Eleanor recalled, laughing softly. Poor Daniel nearly fainted dead away. They shared a moment of quiet understanding, the ability to find humor in memories that once brought only pain, marking a subtle shift. In healing for them both, the sound of approaching hoofbeats interrupted their reverie. A ranch hand galloped toward them, his expression urgent. Boss, that young heifer's in trouble, the one from the Peterson stock. Calf's coming early and wrong. Mason's demeanor changed instantly, the relaxed tour guide replaced by the decisive ranch owner. Where's Hank? He asked, referring to his foreman. Down with that fever that's been going around. Doc's with him now. Mason turned to Eleanor, apology in his eyes. I need to go, she urged immediately. I'll follow. He hesitated only briefly, before nodding and spurring Thunder into a gallop, following the ranch hand toward a distant barn. Eleanor urged Belle into a trot, her concern overriding any apprehension about her riding abilities. The mare seemed to sense her rider's determination, maintaining a steady pace across the snow-covered ground. By the time Eleanor reached the barn, Mason and 2 ranch hands were already working with a distressed young cow. The animal's suffering was evident, her sides heaving with fruitless contractions. Without thinking, Eleanor dismounted and entered the barn, drawn by the drama unfolding within. Calf's turned wrong, one of the hands was saying, his young face greased with worry. Can't birth it natural. Mason had already removed his coat and rolled up his sleeves. We'll have to turn it, he said grimly. Wilson, get those ropes on her. Jenkins, I need more light. Eleanor stepped forward, removing her own coat. Can I help? Mason glanced up, surprise evident on his face. This isn't really... That is, it's not a sight for... I assisted my husband with difficult births, Eleanor interrupted calmly. Human ones, admittedly, but the principles can't be entirely different. A flicker of respect crossed Mason's face. We need to reposition the calf before the mother's too exhausted to push, he explained, accepting her offer. I'll have to reach in and turn it, but she's fighting us. Let me talk to her, Eleanor suggested, approaching the heifer's head. The frightened animal rolled her eyes, but something in Eleanor's gentle voice seemed to reach her. Easy now, mother, she murmured, stroking the cow's neck rhythmically. We're here to help your baby. Remarkably, the heifer calmed somewhat under Eleanor's soothing touch. Mason seized the opportunity, his strong arms working with careful precision as he reached inside to reposition the calf. For 20 tense minutes, they worked together, Eleanor keeping the mother calm, Mason manipulating the unborn calf, the ranch hands providing support and supplies as needed. When the calf finally emerged, wet and seemingly lifeless, Eleanor's heart sank. Mason immediately cleared the calf's airways and began rubbing its chest vigorously. "Come on, little one," he muttered. "Your mama went through too much for you to give up now." As if in response to his urging, the calf suddenly twitched, then gasped a first breath. Within moments, it was weakly trying to lift its head. "That's it!" Mason's face broke into a grin of genuine delight. "Jenkins, make sure they're both comfortable and the calf nurses as soon as possible." Outside the barn, Mason turned to Eleanor, his expression a mixture of amazement and admiration. "That was... you were... I've never seen someone connect with an animal like that on the first meeting." Eleanor felt a blush rise to her cheeks at his praise. It seemed like she just needed reassurance, the same as any mother in distress. Mason studied her for a long moment, something new in his gaze. "You continue to surprise me, Eleanor Reed." The use of her first name sent an unexpected warmth through her, despite the frigid air. "Life as a doctor's wife wasn't all parlors and tea parties," she said lightly. "Daniel believed medicine was a partnership." "He was a wise man," Mason said. Quietly, he hesitated, then added, "Would you like to see something special? A place I don't show to many people." Intrigued, Eleanor nodded. "I'd like that very much." They remounted, Mason leading them away from the main ranch buildings toward a small valley tucked between two gentle rises. As they crested the last hill, Eleanor gasped at the sight below. A natural hot spring bubbled in the center of the sheltered vale, surrounded by rocks that remained free of snow. Steam rose from the water, creating an ethereal mist that hovered above the surface. Most surprising of all, green plants thrived around the spring, despite the winter, creating a startling oasis of life in the frozen landscape. "It's magical," Eleanor breathed as they dismounted near the spring. "The local tribes considered it sacred," Mason explained, leading her closer. "Can't say I blame them. First time I found this spot, I knew this was where I needed to build my life." "Does it ever freeze?" Eleanor asked, watching the steam rise in delicate spirals. Mason shook his head. "Constant temperature year-round. During the worst blizzards, some of the wildlife shelter here." He pointed to tracks in the light snow at the edge of the greenery. "Deer come regularly, even seen elk and the occasional wolf." The intimacy of his sharing this special place was not lost on Eleanor. "Thank you for showing me." Mason's eyes held hers for a long moment. "It's good to share it again. Only Rebecca knew about it before." He glanced away, then back. "She called it our sanctuary." "A perfect name," Eleanor agreed softly. They stood in companionable silence, watching the play of light through the rising steam. Something unspoken passed between them. A recognition of shared understanding, of mutual respect that had grown rapidly during their short acquaintance. The sun was beginning its westward descent when they finally remounted and turned back toward the ranch. As they rode, Eleanor found herself seeing the landscape with new eyes, not as a harsh, forbidding wilderness, but as a place of hidden beauty and unexpected life. Back at the ranch house, they found Mrs. Hathaway in the kitchen, humming as she prepared dinner, with Abigail contentedly sleeping in a basket nearby. "The boys are napping in the cradle," she informed Eleanor. "Been perfect angels, all three." Eleanor felt a surge of gratitude toward this kind woman who had embraced the triplets with such wholehearted affection. "I don't know how to thank you, Mrs. Hathaway." "Nonsense!" the housekeeper replied cheerfully. "Been years since I've had little ones to fuss over. Does my heart feel good?" As Eleanor moved to check on Benjamin and Charlotte, Mason caught Mrs. Hathaway's eye. Some silent communication passed between them, causing the older woman to smile knowingly. "I'll be serving dinner in an hour," she announced. "Time enough for you both to freshen up after your adventures." In the guest room that had become her temporary domain, Eleanor changed into one of the few dresses she'd brought west, a simple blue wool that brought out the color of her eyes. She brushed her hair, hesitating before pinning it back up. Impulsively, she left a few curls loose around her face, a small vanity she hadn't indulged in since Daniel's death. The evening meal was more elaborate than usual, with roast venison, fresh bread, and even an apple pie that filled the house with its cinnamon fragrance. A celebration, Mrs. Hathaway explained when Eleanor commented on the feast. For saving that calf. First of the season always calls for something special. Mason raised his glass of cider. To new beginnings, he said, his eyes meeting Eleanor's across the table. New beginnings, she echoed, feeling the resonance of those simple words in her heart. After dinner, as Mrs. Hathaway cleared the dishes, Mason surprised Eleanor by asking, "Do you play chess? I noticed the board when we unpacked your things. It was Daniel's," she admitted. "He taught me during our courtship, said he wanted a wife who could challenge his mind as well as capture his heart." "Would you honor me with a game?" Mason asked, his manner almost shy. They set up the board before the fireplace, the carved pieces glowing amber in the firelight. Eleanor had not played since Daniel's death, but the familiar movements came back easily. Mason proved to be a thoughtful, strategic player, considering each move carefully. "You play well," he commented, after she captured one of his knights. "Daniel said I was too bold sometimes," Eleanor replied, smiling at the memory. "Taking risks he wouldn't dare." "Bold is good," Mason said, his eyes warm as they met hers across the board, "especially out here." The game continued, their conversation flowing naturally between moves, touching on books they'd both read, places they'd visited, childhood memories. Eleanor learned that Mason had grown up in Kentucky, the son of a horse breeder who had lost everything in the early days of the war. She shared stories of her own upbringing in Philadelphia, the daughter of a professor who had valued education even for his daughters. When Mason finally checkmated her king, they were both surprised to discover that hours had passed. The fire had burned low, and the house was quiet, Mrs. Hathaway having discreetly retired after checking on the sleeping triplets. "I should look in on the babies," Eleanor said, suddenly conscious of how comfortable she had become in Mason's company. "Of course." He rose, offering his hand to help her up from her chair. When she stood, they were closer than either had expected. Her hand still in his, their eyes meeting in the intimate firelight. For a breathless moment, Eleanor thought he might kiss her. More surprising still, she realized she wanted him to. Instead, Mason stepped back respectfully, releasing her hand. "Thank you for the game," he said softly, "and for today. It's been more enjoyable than I can say." "For me as well," Eleanor admitted, her heart beating unexpectedly fast. In the quiet of her room, checking on her peacefully sleeping children, Eleanor confronted the emotions stirring within her. In just a week, Mason Blackwell had gone from stranger to rescuer to, friends seemed too simple a word for the connection forming between them. Daniel had been gone only 3 months. Was it disloyal to feel this pull toward another man? So soon! Yet as she gazed at her children, Eleanor recognized that life in this unforgiving territory required practicality alongside sentiment. A widow with 3 infants needed more than memories to survive. Still, the speed and depth of her growing feelings for Mason unsettled her. It wasn't simply gratitude for their rescue or appreciation of his kindness. There was something more fundamental, a recognition of a kindred spirit, perhaps. A shared understanding of loss and the courage to continue despite it. As snow fell softly outside her window, Eleanor made a decision. She would write to Harriet tomorrow, explaining that their arrival in Helena would be delayed longer than anticipated. The trails were still dangerous, she would say, which was true enough. What she wouldn't say was that she needed time to understand the unexpected path her heart was taking, here in this place that had begun to feel remarkably like home. 2 weeks had passed since Eleanor's letter to Harriet, explaining their delayed arrival. Winter had loosened its grip on the valley somewhat, though the higher mountain passes remained impassable. Each morning, Eleanor found herself hoping for another snowfall to justify extending their stay. The triplets had thrived in the stable environment of Blackwell Ranch. Even tiny Abigail had gained weight, her previously fragile health strengthening. With each passing day, Mason's custom-built cradle had become their favorite sleeping place. The three infants nestled together beneath a quilt Mrs. Hathaway had pieced together from scraps of colorful fabric. Eleanor had established a comfortable routine, helping Mrs. Hathaway with household tasks while caring for the triplets. In the afternoons, when the babies napped, she often joined Mason for rides around the property or assisted with minor ranch chores. Their evenings typically ended with chess matches or discussions of books from Mason's surprisingly extensive library. It was during one such evening that the first complication arrived. "Rider coming!" called a voice from outside, followed by a sharp knock at the door. Mason set aside the book he'd been discussing with Eleanor and rose to answer it. The blast of cold air that accompanied the opening door carried with it a tall, distinguished-looking man in his 50s, his silver hair contrasting with his black overcoat. "Judge Wilson," Mason greeted him with evident surprise. "Didn't expect to see you before spring thaw." "Business in Helena couldn't wait," the judge replied, removing his gloves. His sharp eyes took in Eleanor and the sleeping triplets before returning to Mason. "Got caught in weather coming back. Your foreman suggested I stop here for the night rather than risk the North Pass in darkness." "Of course," Mason agreed, closing the door against the cold. "You're always welcome, Judge. May I introduce Mrs. Eleanor Reed and her children? They've been our guests since the blizzard 3 weeks ago." Judge Wilson bowed slightly in Eleanor's direction. "Horace Wilson, ma'am, circuit judge for this territory." "It's a pleasure to meet you, Judge Wilson," Eleanor responded politely, noting the assessing look he gave her and the triplets. Mrs. Reed was traveling to her cousin in Helena when her wagon broke down in the storm, Mason explained, taking the judge's coat. "Mr. Patterson, her driver, is recovering from frostbite in the bunkhouse." The judge nodded, warming his hands by the fire. "Fortunate that Mason found you, Mrs. Reed. Many wouldn't have survived such exposure." "We're very grateful," Eleanor agreed, sensing an undercurrent in the conversation she couldn't quite identify. Mrs. Hathaway bustled in from the kitchen. "Judge Wilson, a pleasant surprise. I'll prepare the blue room and bring some hot coffee." As the housekeeper departed on her errand, an awkward silence fell. The judge's eyes moved between Mason and Eleanor with unconcealed interest. "Forgive me for observing, Mrs. Reed," he finally said, "but it's unusual to see a young widow traveling with infants in winter. Your circumstances must have been pressing." The polite inquiry barely masked his real question. What respectable woman would undertake such a journey without dire necessity? Before Eleanor could formulate a response that defended her choices without revealing her financial desperation, Mason intervened. "Mrs. Reed's husband was a physician who passed unexpectedly," he said, his tone indicating the subject was delicate. "Her cousin in Helena is her only remaining family." The judge's expression softened slightly. "My condolences, Mrs. Reed. The loss of a spouse is a heavy burden, especially with children to consider." "Thank you," Eleanor murmured, grateful for Mason's diplomatic intervention, yet uncomfortable with the scrutiny. She rose, gathering her sewing. "If you'll excuse me, gentlemen, I should check on the babies and retire. It's been a long day." Mason's eyes held concern as they met hers. "Of course. Rest well, Eleanor." The use of her first name did not go unnoticed by Judge Wilson, whose eyebrows rose fractionally. Eleanor nodded to both men and withdrew to her room, her thoughts troubled. She had become so comfortable in the isolated world of Blackwell Ranch that she'd almost forgotten how their situation might appear to outsiders. An unmarried rancher, a young widow, and 3 infants living under the same roof. Regardless of Mrs. Hathaway's presence as chaperone, tongues would wag. Through the door, she could hear the low murmur of male voices, though she couldn't distinguish Words, the serious tone suggested that Judge Wilson might be expressing similar concerns to Mason. The next morning, Eleanor entered the kitchen to find Mrs. Hathaway preparing a more elaborate breakfast than usual. "Judge Wilson's a man who appreciates a good meal before facing the trail," the housekeeper explained, rolling out biscuit dough with practiced efficiency. Eleanor automatically began helping, cutting the dough into rounds. "He seems formidable." Mrs. Hathaway's expression turned shrewd. "The judge has known Mr. Blackwell since he first claimed this land, acted as something of a mentor after Mr. Tucker's passing." She hesitated, then added more quietly, "He was also close with Miss Rebecca's family." The information added context to the judge's assessing looks. He wasn't merely a visitor, but someone who cared about Mason's welfare and reputation. "I see," Eleanor said carefully, "and he's concerned about my presence here." The housekeeper gave her a direct look. "People talk, Mrs. Reed, especially when it involves a man of Mr. Blackwell's standing in the territory." Before Eleanor could respond, Mason and Judge Wilson entered, deep in conversation about territorial politics. The judge greeted Eleanor with cordial politeness, but she noted that his eyes assessed her with renewed interest. Breakfast passed pleasantly enough, though Eleanor was acutely aware of maintaining perfect propriety in every word and gesture. When Charlotte began fussing from the nearby cradle, Judge Wilson surprised everyone by offering to hold her. "My daughter has 5 little ones," he explained, expertly cradling Charlotte. "I'm quite accustomed to babies." The infant settled against his chest, regarding him with solemn eyes. The judge studied her tiny features, something softening in his stern countenance. "She has your eyes, Mrs. Reed," he observed. "Her father's, actually," Eleanor corrected gently. "Daniel had the same deep blue." "A doctor, Mason tells me," the judge continued. "Where did he practice?" "Philadelphia, primarily," Eleanor replied, wondering at the direction of his questions, though he often traveled to rural areas where medical care was scarce. "A commendable calling," the judge nodded approvingly. "Dedicated to service rather than wealth, I presume?" Eleanor smiled sadly. "Yes, Daniel believed medicine was a vocation, not merely a profession. He never turned away those who couldn't pay." "Which left you in difficult circumstances after his passing," the judge concluded shrewdly. The direct statement caught Eleanor off guard. "Yes," she admitted, seeing no reason to prevaricate. "My journey west wasn't merely for family connection, but financial necessity." The judge handed Charlotte back to Eleanor, his expression thoughtful. "Honesty suits you, Mrs. Reed. Too many would dissemble about such matters." After breakfast, as Judge Wilson prepared to depart, he drew Mason aside for a private word on the porch. Through the window, Eleanor could see their serious expressions, Mason occasionally glancing back toward the house. When Mason returned inside, his face was carefully neutral. "Judge Wilson sends his regards," he told Eleanor. "He was quite taken with your children." "He's a very observant man," Eleanor commented, watching Mason's expression. "Very," Mason agreed, a hint of tension in his voice. "He sees more than most, which makes him an excellent judge, but occasionally intrusive in personal matters." Eleanor gathered her courage. "He disapproves of my staying here." Mason hesitated, clearly weighing his response. He expressed concern about potential gossip. "The judge has always been protective of my reputation in the territory." "A valid concern," Eleanor acknowledged, her heart sinking. The reminder of how their arrangement might appear to others brought reality crashing back. "Perhaps it's time I continued to Helena. Mr. Patterson seems well enough to travel now." A flicker of something, disappointment, alarm, crossed Mason's face. "The North Pass is still dangerous," he said quickly. "The judge only risked it out of necessity, and he's an experienced rider." "Nevertheless," Eleanor pressed, "we've imposed on your hospitality far longer than intended." My cousin must be wondering why we haven't arrived. Mason stepped closer, his voice lowering. Is that what you want, Eleanor? To leave? The direct question demanded an honest answer. No, she admitted softly. But I won't be the cause of damage to your standing here. You've built something remarkable, Mason. This community respects you, and you think your presence threatens that? His blue eyes held hers steadily. A young widow living under your roof with no relation or formal arrangement? Yes, I think. That might raise eyebrows, even in a territory as independent as Montana. Mason ran a hand through his hair, a rare gesture of frustration. The judge suggested a solution, though I hesitated to mention it. Eleanor's pulse quickened. What solution? A formal arrangement, Mason said carefully. Of employment, that is. He suggested that naming you as the ranch's governess and tutor for when the Hand's children visit would provide a respectable explanation for your presence. The proposal was practical, even thoughtful. Yet Eleanor felt a surprising wave of disappointment. I see, a business arrangement. It would be in name only, Mason hastened to add. Nothing would change about our... That is, you wouldn't be expected to actually teach unless you wanted to. The awkwardness between them was new and uncomfortable. Eleanor found herself missing the easy companionship they'd developed. I'll consider it, she said finally. Thank you for trying to find a solution. Before Mason could respond, a commotion from the bunkhouse drew their attention. Dr. Tucker was hurrying toward the main house, his grave. Patterson's taken a turn, he announced without preamble when Mason opened the door. Infection set in. I need to operate, remove more of the damaged tissue. Eleanor gasped. Will he survive? The doctor's tired eyes met hers sympathetically. I can't promise anything, Mrs. Reed. Gangrene's a nasty business. But without surgery, he has no chance at all. Do whatever you must, she said firmly. I'll assist if needed. That won't be necessary, Dr. Tucker assured her. Mason's foreman Hank has steady hands, and he's helped me before. But I will need your permission as Patterson's employer. Eleanor nodded quickly. Of course, please save him if you can. As the doctor hurried back to prepare for the operation, Mason touched Eleanor's arm gently. This isn't your fault, he said, reading the guilt in her expression. Isn't it? She challenged quietly. If I hadn't insisted on traveling in winter... Patterson knew the risks, Mason countered. We all do living out here. Nature doesn't care about our plans or needs. His calm acceptance of frontier reality steadied her. Still, as preparations for the surgery continued, Eleanor found herself pacing anxiously, checking on the triplets frequently as a distraction from her worry. By evening, the surgery was complete. Dr. Tucker, exhausted but cautiously optimistic, reported that he'd removed the infected tissue and that Patterson was resting as comfortably as could be expected. The next 48 hours will tell, he concluded, accepting the coffee Mrs. Hathaway pressed into his hands. If fever doesn't set in, he has a good chance. Relief washed over Eleanor, though it was tempered by continued concern. When might he be well enough to travel? She asked, thinking of her delayed journey. The doctor and Mason exchanged glances. Not for at least a month, Dr. Tucker said firmly. Possibly longer, and even then he shouldn't drive a wagon that distance. The strain could reopen the wounds. As the news effectively ended any immediate plans for departing to Helena, Eleanor felt conflicted, relieved at the legitimate reason to remain at Blackwell Ranch, yet increasingly aware of the complications their extended stay created. That night, unable to sleep despite her exhaustion, Eleanor slipped out to check on the triplets in the main room. She found Mason already there, standing over the cradle with a thoughtful expression. "You should rest," he said softly as she approached. "It's been a difficult day." My mind won't quiet, she admitted. Too many concerns circling. In the dim firelight, Mason's face was cast in shifting shadows that emphasized its strong planes. About Patterson? The doctor thinks he'll recover, given time. Partly that, Eleanor acknowledged, coming to stand beside him, and partly other matters. Mason's eyes met hers in the firelight. Judge Wilson's concerns, among others. She gazed down at her sleeping children. I never imagined this situation when we left Pennsylvania. How complicated everything would become. Life rarely follows the paths we imagine, Mason observed, his voice gentle. Sometimes the unexpected turns lead to better destinations. The quiet statement hung in the air between them, filled with unspoken meaning. Eleanor found herself acutely aware of their proximity, of the steady strength that emanated from him. I've been thinking about the judge's suggestion, she said carefully, the governor's position. Mason nodded, his expression guarded. It would resolve certain appearances, but create others, Eleanor pointed out quietly. The relationship between employer and employee has its own boundaries. Understanding dawned in Mason's eyes. Boundaries that might be restrictive. Yes, the single word carried weight beyond its simplicity. Mason turned to face her fully, the firelight catching gold highlights in his dark hair. Eleanor, I want to be clear. I offered you that position only because it seemed the simplest solution, to satisfy convention, not because it reflects how He trailed off, seeming to search for words. How you what? She prompted softly. How I've come to think of you, he finished, his voice deepening. Which is not as an employee or even merely a friend. Eleanor's heart quickened. Mason, the sudden cry of Benjamin from the cradle interrupted the moment. Eleanor automatically moved to soothe him, lifting the fussing infant before he could. Wake his sisters. He's hungry, she said, cradling him close. Mason stepped back, the intimate atmosphere broken. I'll leave you to tend to him. Mason, Eleanor called softly as he reached the doorway. He turned, his expression questioning. We should continue this conversation. Tomorrow, perhaps. His smile was gentle in the firelight. Tomorrow, then. But tomorrow brought its own complications. Shortly after breakfast, a ranch hand arrived, with news that a wolf pack had attacked one of the outlying herds during the night. Mason and most of the hands rode out immediately to assess the damage and move the remaining cattle to safer pastures. Late morning brought another unexpected visitor, this time a woman in her early 40s, elegantly dressed despite the rigors of winter travel. Victoria Palmer, she introduced herself when Mrs. Hathaway opened the door. I'm looking for Mason Blackwell. The housekeeper's expression revealed recognition and subtle dismay. Mr. Blackwell is attending to ranch business, Mrs. Palmer. He's not expected back until evening. The visitor's perfectly arched eyebrows rose slightly. Then I shall wait. The journey from Helena was tiring, and I've no intention of turning around without seeing him. Mrs. Hathaway had little choice but to invite her in. As the woman removed her fur-trimmed coat and gloves, her assessing gaze fell on Eleanor, who was sitting near the fire with Abigail in her arms. And you are? Mrs. Palmer inquired, her tone suggesting Eleanor might be a servant. Eleanor Reed, she replied, rising to acknowledge the visitor properly. A guest of Mr. Blackwell's. Something calculating flickered in Victoria Palmer's eyes. Indeed. How unexpected. Mrs. Hathaway intervened smoothly. Mrs. Reed and her children were caught in the blizzard last month. Mr. Blackwell rescued them from certain death. How heroic, Mrs. Palmer commented, her tone suggesting she found it anything but. She settled herself in the chair closest to the fire, arranging her skirts with practiced precision. Mason always did have a weakness for strays. The deliberate insult hung in the air. Eleanor felt colour rise to her cheeks, but maintained her composure. "Mr. Blackwell has been exceedingly kind," she agreed mildly, "as have Mrs. Hathaway and everyone at the ranch." Mrs. Palmer's cool smile didn't reach her eyes. "Yes, Martha has always been devoted to the ranch, even after poor Rebecca's passing." The familiar use of Mrs. Hathaway's first name and the pointed reference to Mason's late wife established this woman's claim to intimacy with the household. "Coffee, Mrs. Palmer?" Mrs. Hathaway offered, her expression carefully neutral. "Please." The visitor turned her attention to Abigail, who was watching her with solemn eyes. "Your child?" "One of 3, Eleanor replied, noting the flash of surprise that crossed the other woman's face. "Triplets," Mrs. Palmer recovered quickly. "How challenging. And your husband?" "Passed away shortly before their birth," Eleanor said simply, unwilling to share Daniel's memory with this coolly hostile stranger. "How unfortunate." The words carried no genuine sympathy. "And now you find yourself here, at Blackwell Ranch, with 3 infants. Quite the coincidence." The implication that Eleanor had engineered their situation to secure Mason's protection was too blatant to ignore. "There was nothing fortunate about being stranded in a blizzard, Mrs. Palmer," she replied with quiet dignity. "Had Mr. Blackwell not found us, my children and I would have perished." Something like grudging respect flickered in the other woman's eyes. "Yes, well, Mason always did have a talent for timely arrivals." Mrs. Hathaway returned with coffee, her expression suggesting she'd deliberately taken her time to give Eleanor a moment to assess the visitor. "Mrs. Palmer was a dear friend of Rebecca's," she explained to Eleanor, providing necessary context. "Their families were acquainted in Missouri before the war." "More than acquainted," Mrs. Palmer corrected smoothly. "The Blackwells and Palmers have been connected for generations. My late husband Gregory was Mason's second cousin." The information clarified the woman's proprietary attitude. A widow with family connections to Mason, clearly she saw herself as having some claim to his attention, perhaps even his future. If confirming this assessment, Mrs. Palmer added, "I've been managing my late husband's business interests in Helena since his passing 2 years ago. Mason has been kind enough to advise me on several matters. In fact, that's partly why I've come today, business that couldn't wait for his next visit to town." The explanation sounded plausible, but Eleanor sensed other motives beneath the surface. This woman had not traveled through difficult winter conditions merely for business advice. The triplets chose that moment to make their presence known, with Charlotte and Benjamin waking simultaneously. Their demands for attention created a welcome diversion from the tense conversation. "You must excuse me," Eleanor said, rising with Abigail still in her arms. "The children need tending." Mrs. Palmer waved a dismissive hand. "Of course, children are so consuming one's attention." The subtle distaste in her tone suggested she found infants more nuisance than blessing. Eleanor retreated to her room, with the triplets, grateful for the escape from the visitor's calculating gaze. Through the partially open door, she could hear Mrs. Palmer questioning Mrs. Hathaway about how long the strays intended to remain. The housekeeper's replies were polite but non-committal, protecting both Eleanor's privacy and Mason's business. As she tended to her children, Eleanor confronted an uncomfortable truth. Their prolonged stay at Blackwell Ranch had created complications neither she nor Mason had anticipated. Judge Wilson's concern about propriety, Mrs. Palmer's obvious territorial feelings, Mr. Patterson's extended recovery, all combined to create a situation that grew more complex with each passing day. Yet beneath these external complications lay a more personal one, her deepening feelings for Mason Blackwell and the growing sense that he returned them. Their interrupted conversation the previous night had hovered on the brink of declarations neither was quite ready to make. Eleanor gazed at her 3 children, now fed and content. Their future, once so uncertain, had begun to take shape in her mind, a future that increasingly included Mason and this ranch that had become a haven. But as Mrs. Palmer's presence made clear, others had their own visions for Mason's future, and Eleanor's place in it was far from secured. Mason returned to the ranch house well after sunset, exhaustion evident in the set of his shoulders. The wolf attack had been worse than initially reported, with 8 calves lost and 2 cows badly injured. As he stamped snow from his boots on the porch, he was already calculating the impact on spring profits. The sight that greeted him inside drove all thoughts of business from his mind. Victoria Palmer sat enthroned by the fire, while Eleanor politely served tea, her back straight as a ramrod. The tension between the women was palpable, though both maintained flawless frontier courtesy. "Mason, darling." Victoria rose immediately, crossing to him with outstretched hands. "I've been waiting simply hours." Mason masked his surprise, accepting her brief embrace with practiced politeness. "Victoria, I wasn't expecting you until the spring meeting in Helena." Her practiced laugh tinkled through the room. "Business couldn't wait, I'm afraid. Those timber contracts need your signature by the end of the month." Eleanor quietly gathered the tea things, her eyes downcast. "I'll leave you to your business discussion," she murmured. "No need," Mason said quickly, perhaps too quickly. "You've as much right to be comfortable in the main room as any guest." Victoria's eyebrow arched delicately at his tone. "Actually, Mason, these matters are somewhat confidential. Perhaps Mrs. Reed wouldn't mind giving us a moment." Though phrased as a request, the dismissal was unmistakable. Eleanor nodded with dignity. "Of course. I should check on the triplets anyway." As she left the room, Mason noted the graceful set of her shoulders, the quiet confidence she carried despite Victoria's barely veiled hostility. In the weeks since her arrival, Eleanor had transformed from a desperate mother on the brink of tragedy to a woman growing into her own strength. "Well," Victoria said when they were alone, rearranging herself by the fire, "she's certainly made herself at home." Mason removed his coat, deliberately taking his time before responding. "Mrs. Reed and her children are my guests for as long as they need shelter." "How charitable," Victoria observed, her tone suggesting it was anything but. "Though I must say, Mason, even for the frontier, this arrangement is raising eyebrows. Judge Wilson mentioned his concerns when he passed through Helena. The knowledge that the judge had discussed the situation with others irritated Mason more than he cared to admit. "Judge Wilson should mind his own affairs," he said shortly. Victoria's expression softened to one of practiced concern. "He considers you his affair, Mason, as do I. We care about your standing in the territory." She rose, moving closer to lay a hand on his arm. "Your reputation is impeccable. The successful rancher, the war hero, the grieving widower who built an empire from wilderness. People respect you." Her voice lowered. "Don't jeopardize that for a pretty face with 3 ready-made children." The condescension in her tone sparked a rare anger in Mason. "Eleanor Reed is not some opportunist, Victoria. She's a woman of character, who lost her husband and is doing everything in her power to provide for her children." Victoria's eyes narrowed at his defense. "You're on quite familiar terms, using her given name." "We've moved beyond formalities," Mason replied evenly. "Shared danger tends to do that, I'm sure." Victoria stepped back, her smile tightening. "Well, I did bring those contracts for your review. And another matter. The Henderson property, adjoining your north pasture, is available. I thought you might be interested, given your expansion plans." The abrupt shift to business was typical of Victoria's tactics. Mason had known her long enough to recognize when she was redirecting a conversation that wasn't going her way. "I'll look at both in the morning." he said, making no effort to hide his weariness. "It's been a long day, Victoria, and tomorrow will bring more of the same." She pouted prettily. "You're not sending me back to Helena tonight, surely?" "The roads are dreadful, and it's already dark." Mason sighed inwardly. Victoria had clearly planned to stay from the moment she arrived. "Mrs. Hathaway will prepare the guest room. You're welcome to remain until morning." Her smile was triumphant. "So kind of you, Mason. I knew you wouldn't disappoint me." After arranging for Victoria's accommodation, Mason found himself drawn to the partially open door of Eleanor's room. Soft singing drifted out, a lullaby he didn't recognize but found achingly beautiful. He hesitated, then knocked gently. Eleanor opened the door, surprise flickering across her face. "Mason, I thought you'd be occupied with Mrs. Palmer." "Business can wait until morning," he said quietly. "May I come in? Just for a moment." She stepped aside, allowing him into the lamplit room. The triplets were settled in their cradle, Benjamin already asleep, while his sisters fought drowsiness. "With diminishing success. They've grown," Mason observed, marveling at the change in the infants since their arrival. Where once they had seemed fragile, especially tiny Abigail, now they were plump and vibrant with health. "Children have a remarkable capacity for resilience," Eleanor agreed, her voice soft to avoid disturbing their descent into sleep. "As do their mothers, I'm learning." Mason studied her face in the gentle light. "I wanted to apologize for Victoria's manner. She can be territorial about things she considers hers." A flicker of something, hurt perhaps, crossed Eleanor's expression. "And she considers you hers." It wasn't a question, but Mason answered anyway. "Victoria has certain expectations that I've never encouraged. Her husband was my cousin, but our relationship has always been business-focused, despite her attempts to suggest otherwise." Eleanor nodded, though uncertainty lingered in her eyes. "It's not my place to question your relationships, Mason. Isn't it?" The question hung between them, weighted with meaning. Before she could respond, Charlotte gave a final protest against sleep, her tiny fists waving. Eleanor automatically moved to the cradle, soothing the infant with a gentle touch. Mason watched her, struck anew by the natural grace with which she mothered. "You're remarkable with them," he said softly. "They're all I have left of Daniel," she replied, sadness briefly shadowing her features. "And yet they're entirely their own little people, with personalities already so distinct." Her statement crystallized something Mason had been pondering. "You honor him through your love for them," he observed, "without being defined solely as his widow." Eleanor's eyes widened slightly at his insight. "Yes," she said after a moment, "that's exactly it. Daniel will always be part of me, part of them. But life continues, demanding that we do more than merely survive past loss. That we actually live," Mason agreed, thinking of his own journey through grief. "It took me years to understand that continuing to live isn't a betrayal of those we've lost." The triplets had finally surrendered to sleep, their tiny chests rising and falling in perfect synchrony. In the quiet that followed, Mason found himself standing closer to Eleanor than he'd realized, drawn by the intimacy of shared understanding. "Eleanor," he began, his voice low, "I need to tell you." A sharp knock at the door interrupted him. Mrs. Hathaway's apologetic face appeared. "Begging your pardon, but Mrs. Palmer is asking for hot water for her toilet, and there's a ranch hand with an urgent question about tomorrow's rotations." Mason suppressed a sigh. "Thank you, Mrs. Hathaway. I'll be right there." When the housekeeper withdrew, Eleanor gave him a gentle smile. "Duty calls." "Always," he agreed ruefully, "but this conversation isn't finished." "I'll hold you to that," she promised, her eyes meeting him with newfound confidence. The morning brought a fresh complication. A letter arrived from Harriet in Saïsim, Helena, carried by the same courier who delivered supplies from town. Her tone had shifted from relief to growing impatience. "She expects us within the week," Eleanor told Mason as they walked toward the corral after breakfast. Victoria had departed early, her mood soured by Mason's refusal to commit to the Henderson property purchase without proper consideration. Apparently, she's arranged introductions with several suitable gentlemen in Helena society. Mason's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Including that Dr. Judge Wilson mentioned? Specifically him," Eleanor confirmed, watching his reaction. "Dr. Lawrence Fitzgerald, recently widowed, with a thriving practice and a handsome residence near the church," according to Harriet. They reached the corral fence, where Mason's prize stallion Thunder greeted them with interest. Eleanor offered, her palm to the horse, who nuzzled it gently. "He's taken to you," Mason observed, his voice deliberately casual. "Thunder doesn't usually warm to strangers." "Perhaps I'm no longer a stranger," Eleanor suggested, matching his tone while avoiding his eyes. Mason turned to face her fully. "Is that what you want, Eleanor? To meet this Dr. Fitzgerald? To establish yourself in Helena society?" The direct question demanded honesty. Eleanor took a deep breath, the cold air crystallizing it into a visible cloud. "When I left Pennsylvania, I believed my cousin's home was the only option for my children's future. I had no skills beyond those of a doctor's wife, no resources beyond what little Daniel left." She stroked Thunder's velvet nose, gathering her thoughts. "Then the blizzard came and you found us, and suddenly—" She met his eyes. "Suddenly I discovered capabilities I never knew I possessed, strength I didn't realize I had." "You were always strong," Mason said quietly. "The storm just revealed it." Eleanor shook her head. "It wasn't just the storm. It was this place." She gestured to the ranch spread around them. "The challenges here demand growth. There's no room for helplessness on the frontier." Mason's eyes never left her face. "And Helena, what does it offer that you can't find here?" The question laid bare the choice before her. Security, perhaps, familiarity, a life more like the one I knew before. "But not the one you want now," Mason suggested, reading between her words. Eleanor's smile held a new confidence. "I'm discovering that what I want has changed, that I've changed." A shout from the bunkhouse interrupted their exchange. Dr. Tucker emerged, beckoning urgently to Mason. "It's Patterson," the doctor explained when they hurried over. "Fever's broken, and he's asking for Mrs. Reed." Eleanor entered the bunkhouse to find her driver propped up on pillows, his face gaunt but his eyes clear for the first time in days. "Mrs. Reed," he greeted her weakly, "been worried about you and them little ones." "We're all well, Mr. Patterson," she assured him, taking the chair beside his bed. "Thanks to your bravery and Mr. Blackwell's timely arrival." The driver shook. His head. "Wasn't brave, was foolish heading out in that storm. Should have insisted we turn back earlier." His expression grew earnest. "But that's not why I asked to see you. Need to tell you something important." Eleanor leaned closer, concerned by his urgency. "What is it?" "Your cousin in Helena," Patterson said, his voice strengthening with purpose. "Something didn't sit right when I met her in Pennsylvania. Keep thinking about it during our journey." Unease stirred in Eleanor's stomach. "What do you mean?" "The way she talked about you and the little ones, Mom. Like you were burdens she was reluctantly taking on, not family she was welcoming." His weathered face creased with concern. "And there was a man with her when she met me to arrange transport. Overheard them talking when they thought I'd stepped away. She said something about securing the Reed inheritance once the widow arrives." The revelation struck Eleanor like a physical blow. Inheritance. There's nothing left. Daniel's debts. Consumed almost everything. "Begging your pardon, Mom, But your cousin seemed mighty convinced otherwise. That's why I've been so troubled, even in my fevered state. Keep thinking I was sending you into some kind of trap." Dr. Tucker stepped forward. "That's enough excitement. For now, Patterson, Mrs. Reed needs time to consider this information, and you need rest." Outside the bunkhouse, Eleanor stood motionless, attempting to process this unexpected development. Mason joined her, concern evident in his expression. "Troubling news?" he asked gently. Eleanor recounted Patterson's warning, her thoughts racing. "It makes no sense. Daniel's practice barely supported us toward the end, with him taking so many charity cases. The house had a second mortgage. There's nothing for Harriet to claim." Mason's expression grew thoughtful. "Unless there's something you don't know about. Did your husband have family investments? Property held in trust?" "Not that he ever mentioned." Eleanor frowned, then suddenly gasped. "Wait! There was his grandfather's land grant in Montana Territory. Daniel always dismissed it as worthless, unsurveyed wilderness somewhere west of Helena. He inherited it as the last living Reed, but never bothered to claim it formally." Land grants can be valuable, especially with the railroad expansion, Mason observed. "Your cousin may have learned something you don't know about that property." Eleanor's mind whirled with implications. If that's true, then her invitation wasn't charity, but calculation. She needed me and Helena to claim an inheritance she couldn't access without me. "Or without your children," Mason added grimly. "As Daniel's heirs." The suggestion sent a chill through Eleanor that had nothing to do with the winter air. "She's been pressing me particularly about bringing the triplets. Said she had a nurse already arranged." Mason's jaw tightened. "To separate you from them, perhaps, make them wards under her influence. I can't believe Harriet would... But then, I barely know her anymore." Eleanor wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly feeling vulnerable. "What shall I do? If there is an inheritance, it rightfully belongs to my children." Mason placed a steadying hand on her shoulder. "First, we verify Patterson's suspicions. I know people in Helena who can make discreet inquiries about your cousin's activities and any claims being prepared regarding Reed property." His calm practicality anchored Eleanor amid her swirling concerns. "Thank you, Mason. I don't know what I would have done if—" "You would have managed," he interrupted with surprising firmness. "You're stronger than you realize, Eleanor Reed. You would have protected your children, with or without assistance." His faith in her capacity stirred something profound within Eleanor, a recognition that the woman who had left Pennsylvania in desperate circumstances no longer existed. In her place stood someone tempered by adversity, capable of facing challenges directly. "Yes," she agreed, straightening her shoulders. "I would have." The afternoon brought fresh snow, confining everyone to indoor activities. Eleanor used the time to sort through Daniel's papers, which she'd brought west in a small trunk. Most were medical notes or personal correspondence, but one envelope, marked simply Montana, contained yellow documents regarding the territorial land grant, 5,000 acres along the western fork of the Missouri, Eleanor read aloud to Mason in the privacy of his study. "Granted to Jeremiah Reed in 1839 for services to the government in early exploration." Mason whistled softly. "That's substantial acreage, especially if it includes water access. With the right survey and registration, it could be worth considerable money to the right buyer." "There's a map," Eleanor continued, unfolding a fragile parchment. "Though it's vague by modern standards, just landmarks and rough distances." Mason studied the crude map, his expression growing increasingly interested. "Eleanor, if I'm reading this correctly, this land adjoins the Henderson property Victoria was pressing me to purchase yesterday." "That can't be coincidence," Eleanor murmured, the pieces beginning to fall into place. "If Harriet has been inquiring about the Reed grant, word would have spread in Helena business circles," Mason finished. "Victoria must have learned of it during her last visit." The realization that her children's inheritance was already the subject of speculation and possible exploitation strengthened Eleanor's resolve. I need to secure their rights to this land, regardless of its value. It's their legacy from Daniel's family. We'll ride to the county seat tomorrow, Mason decided. The land office there can begin the formal registration process based on these original documents. That should protect your claim until a proper survey can be conducted in spring. The use of "we" wasn't lost on Eleanor. Despite the complications her presence had brought to his life, Mason remained steadfastly supportive. "Why are you helping us so much?" she asked suddenly, the question that had lingered in her mind finally finding its voice. "You've gone far. Beyond mere frontier hospitality, Mason." He was silent for a long moment, his eyes holding hers across the desk. "Because from the moment I found you in that snowstorm, huddled around your children, using your body to shield them from certain death, I recognized something I thought I'd never find again." "What?" Eleanor whispered, hardly daring to breathe. "A heart that matches my own," he said simply. "Brave, resilient, capable of deep love despite profound loss." The honesty of his words stripped away any pretense between them. Eleanor felt tears spring to her eyes, not from sadness, but from the profound relief of being truly seen. "I've been fighting it," she admitted quietly, "feeling that any new attachment somehow diminishes what I had with Daniel." "I understand," Mason nodded. "I've felt the same about Rebecca for years, but I've come to believe that love isn't diminished by being shared across time. It's transformed, certainly, but not lessened." Eleanor rose from her chair, moving to the window where late afternoon light filtered through falling snow. "When Daniel died, I thought that part of my life was over, that I would simply exist for my children, never expecting joy for myself again." Mason joined her at the window, careful to maintain a respectful distance. "And now?" She turned to face him, her expression both vulnerable and determined. "Now I find myself contemplating possibilities I never imagined. A different kind of life than the one I planned, a different kind of strength than I knew I possessed." "Eleanor," Mason said softly, "whatever you decide about Helena, about your cousin, about the land, know that you've earned the right to choose your own path forward, not out of desperation or necessity, but from confidence in your own judgment." The affirmation of her transformation touched Eleanor deeply. The woman who had left Pennsylvania had been defined by loss and limitation. The woman standing in Mason's study was defined by possibility and newfound strength. "I've made my decision," she said with quiet certainty. "I won't be going to Helena to stay with Harriet. Whatever she may have planned, I won't deliver my children into a situation where their welfare isn't the primary concern." Relief washed over Mason's features, quickly masked by careful neutrality. "You're welcome to remain here until you determine your next steps. The ranch has plenty of room." Eleanor smiled at his deliberate formality. "My next steps will depend greatly on certain conversations that keep getting interrupted." Understanding dawned in Mason's eyes, followed by a warmth that transformed his usually reserved expression. "Perhaps we should ensure this one reaches its conclusion." Before he could continue, however, Mrs. Hathaway's voice called from the hallway. "Mr. Blackwell, riders coming, looks like trouble." Their eyes met in shared frustration at yet another interruption. "This conversation will happen," Mason promised, his voice low and intent. "Even if I have to lock every door in the house to ensure it." Eleanor laughed, the sound bright with newfound confidence. "I'm counting on it, Mason Blackwell. Some transformations demand proper acknowledgement." As they moved to address the new situation, Eleanor felt a profound sense of peace, despite the uncertain circumstances surrounding her cousin's apparent schemes. Whatever challenges lay ahead, she would face them not as a helpless widow, but as a woman who had discovered her own capacity for strength, resilience, and, most surprisingly, new love. The approaching riders turned out to be Judge Wilson, accompanied by two men Eleanor didn't recognize. Their serious expressions suggested this wasn't a social call. "Mason," the judge greeted tersely as they dismounted. "Mrs. Reed, we need to speak privately." In Mason's study, the judge introduced his companions, Marshal Jenkins of the Territorial Law Enforcement and Mr. Gregory Adams, a lawyer from Helena. "There's been a development regarding your cousin, Mrs. Reed," the judge began without preamble. "She's been arrested for attempted fraud and conspiracy." Eleanor gasped. "Arrested? What happened?" Marshal Jenkins took up the explanation. "Mrs. Harriet Fulton and her associate, a Mr. Lewis Clark, have been attempting to file falsified documents regarding a substantial land grant. When our office began investigating, based on information provided by Mr. Blackwell's associates in Helena, we discovered evidence of a broader scheme." "What kind of scheme?" Mason asked, his hand instinctively finding Eleanor's shoulder in support. Mr. Adams, the lawyer, opened his portfolio. "It appears they intended to gain guardianship of Mrs. Reed's children through legal manipulation, then use their status as Daniel Reed's heirs to claim the land grant. Once the property was secured, the children would be relegated to a frontier orphanage, while Mrs. Fulton and Mr. Clark profited from the sale of the land." The coldness of the plot struck Eleanor like a physical blow. "An orphanage? She would have placed my babies in an orphanage?" "I'm afraid the evidence suggests exactly that," the judge confirmed grimly. "Letters between Mrs. Fulton and Mr. Clark detailed the plan quite explicitly. They needed you in Helena to complete the initial paperwork, but never intended for you to remain in the picture." "How did you discover this?" Mason asked, his voice tight with controlled anger. "Ironically, through Mrs. Palmer," the judge replied. "She mentioned to me that you refused to purchase the Henderson property until you'd investigated its connection to a Reed land grant. That alerted me to potential irregularities, as I'd already heard rumors of unusual activity regarding unclaimed territorial grants." Eleanor's mind reeled with the implications. "So if Mason hadn't sent inquiries to Helena, you would have walked into a carefully laid trap," Marshal Jenkins finished bluntly. "Your cousin was quite desperate for money after her husband's failed investments. The land grant offered a solution if she could control Daniel Reed's heirs." "Which is why we're here," Mr. Adams continued. "As your late husband's legal representative in the territory, I need your signature on these documents to secure the land grant officially in your children's names, with you as trustee until they come of age." Eleanor stared at the papers before her, still processing the narrowly avoided disaster. "All this time I believed Harriet was offering sanctuary out of family loyalty. The betrayal of family is always the most difficult to comprehend," Judge Wilson observed quietly. "But fortunately, you found true allies instead." The judge's pointed glance at Mason acknowledged what everyone in the room understood. The blizzard that had threatened their lives had ultimately saved them from a different kind of destruction. Once the necessary documents were signed, and the officials departed with promises to keep Eleanor informed of the legal proceedings against Harriet, Mason and Eleanor found themselves alone in the study. The revelations of the day hung between them like a physical presence. "I can't quite believe it," Eleanor said finally, sinking into a chair. "My own cousin." Mason knelt beside her, taking her hands in his. "What matters now is that you and your children are safe. The land grant is secured in their names. Their future has a foundation." Eleanor looked into his eyes, finding strength there that helped steady her tumultuous emotions. "Because of you, Mason, if you hadn't found us in that storm, if you hadn't welcomed us into your home, if you hadn't made those inquiries in Helena, if, he interrupted gently, We could trace 1,000 paths that might have led elsewhere. What matters is the one we actually traveled. His practical wisdom grounded her, as it had so many times over the past weeks. Eleanor squeezed his hands, drawing from his steadiness. "You're right," she acknowledged, "and that path has brought me to a crossroads I never anticipated." Mason's expression grew serious. "With Harriet's plans exposed, you're free to chart your own course, Eleanor. Whatever you decide, I'll support you." The deliberate neutrality of his tone couldn't quite mask the tension beneath. Eleanor recognized what it cost him to offer this freedom without pressing his own hopes. "The land grant changes things," she said thoughtfully. "The children will have financial security regardless of what path I choose." "Yes," Mason agreed. "Once surveyed and properly registered, it represents substantial value. You could establish yourself anywhere you wished." Eleanor studied his face, noting the careful control he maintained. "Is that what you think I should do? Establish myself elsewhere?" Something flickered in Mason's eyes, vulnerability quickly masked. "What I think doesn't matter, Eleanor. For perhaps the first time since Daniel's death, you have genuine choice." "That's what matters. It matters to me," she countered softly. "Your opinion, your wishes." The discipline that had carried Mason through war, loss, and the building of his ranch seemed to waver. "If I speak what's in my heart," he said slowly, "I risk influencing your decision out of your gratitude or sense of obligation. I won't do that to you, Eleanor." She rose from her chair, moving to the window where February sunlight sparkled on fresh snow. Outside, ranch hands were clearing paths between buildings, their breath forming clouds in the crisp air. This scene, once foreign, had become comfortingly familiar. "When I look out there," Eleanor said quietly, "I don't see an isolated wilderness anymore. I see possibilities, life carved from challenge, beauty in the midst of hardship." She turned to face him. "That transformation isn't just about the landscape, Mason. It's about me, about who I've become here." Mason remained motionless, his eyes never leaving her face. "And who is that?" "A woman who understands her own strength, who has discovered capabilities she never knew she possessed." Eleanor moved toward him with newfound confidence. "A woman who knows what she wants, rather than merely accepting what circumstances dictate." "And what do you want, Eleanor Reed?" Mason asked, his voice deepening with emotion he no longer tried to conceal. "A life built on choice rather than necessity, partnership rather than dependence." She stopped directly before him. "Love born of mutual respect, not mere gratitude or convenience." Mason drew a shaky breath. "I've been falling in love with you since the moment I found you protecting your children with your last strength in that blizzard," he confessed, the words rushing out as if he'd held them back too long. "Everything since, your courage, your resilience, your gentle heart, has only deepened those feelings." Joy bloomed in Eleanor's chest, bright and unexpected. "I've been fighting my feelings for you," she admitted, "telling myself it was too soon after Daniel, that I was confusing gratitude with deeper emotion. And now?" Mason prompted, hope dawning in his eyes. "Now I understand that the heart doesn't follow a timetable, that new love doesn't diminish what came before." She reached up to touch his cheek gently. "I love you, Mason Blackwell, not because you rescued us, but because of who you are, the man I've come to know through both crisis and everyday moments." The declaration hung in the air between them, transforming everything. Mason covered her hand with his own, turning to press a kiss to her palm. "I never thought to find this again," he said, voice rough with emotion. "After Rebecca, I believed that part of my life was finished." "As did I after Daniel," Eleanor replied softly. "We were both wrong." Mason drew her closer, one hand cradling her face with exquisite gentleness. "Eleanor Reed, would you consider making your home here permanently, not as my guest or employee, but as my wife? Would you allow me the honor of helping you raise your children, of being a father to them in truth as well as name?" The directness of his proposal, devoid of flourish yet full of genuine feeling, touched Eleanor deeply. "Yes," she answered simply. "With all my heart, yes." Their first kiss was gentle, a promise rather than a passion, sweet with the knowledge of all they had overcome to reach this moment. When they parted, Mason rested his forehead against hers, a smile transforming his usually serious features. "Mrs. Hathaway will be insufferably pleased with herself," he murmured. "She's been dropping hints for weeks." Eleanor laughed, the sound bright with happiness. "She told me the day after we arrived that you looked at me like a man dying of thirst, regarding—" "Water, observant woman," Mason acknowledged with a chuckle. "Though the metaphor falls short. You're not just water to a parched man, Eleanor. You're spring after winter, hope after despair." A sudden cry from the main room interrupted the moment. One of the triplets had awakened from their nap. Eleanor smiled up at Mason. "Reality calls." "The best kind of reality," he replied, taking her hand as they went to tend to the children, who would soon be officially his as well. The following weeks passed in a whirlwind of activity as news of their engagement spread throughout the territory. Mrs. Hathaway did indeed take considerable satisfaction in the development, immediately beginning preparations for a spring wedding that would, as she put it, give this house the family it was always meant to hold. Judge Wilson, upon hearing the news, rode out specifically to offer his blessing. "Knew it the moment I saw you together," he told Mason gruffly. "Some matches are written in the stars, boy. Took you long enough to recognize it." Even Victoria Palmer eventually sent a stiffly polite note of congratulation, though her acceptance of a business opportunity in San Francisco suggested she had no intention of witnessing the union in person. Mr. Patterson, now recovered enough to move about with a cane, requested and received permission to stay on at Blackwell Ranch as a permanent hand. "Got nowhere particular to return to," he explained to Eleanor, "and I've grown fond of those little ones. Like to see them grow up." The most profound changes, however, occurred within the main house itself. The room that had been Mason's study gradually transformed into a nursery as he moved his business affairs to a smaller room off the kitchen. The library expanded with children's books ordered from back east. The workshop was filled with projects intended for 3 growing children: building blocks, tiny chairs, a rocking horse large enough for triplets to take turns. Each modification to the ranch house reflected Mason's wholehearted embrace of his new family. Nothing was too small for his attention, from ensuring the kitchen cupboards were secured against curious toddlers to planning expansions that would accommodate 3 children growing toward adulthood. "You've thought of everything," Eleanor remarked one evening as they reviewed his sketches for additional bedrooms, once the triplets outgrew sharing space. "Not everything," Mason replied with a smile. "Left the flower garden planning entirely to you. My talents end at structural necessities." Eleanor studied the careful drawings, noting how he'd incorporated space for the children to have both privacy and togetherness as they grew. "They'll never remember a time when you weren't their father," she said softly. "What a gift that is." Mason set aside his pencil, expression growing serious. "I've been thinking about that, about Daniel's place in their lives." Eleanor waited, touched by his consideration of the man whose absence had set their story in motion. "I want them to know him, Eleanor. Through your stories, through his medical journals, through the legacy he left them." Mason took her hand. "I don't want to replace him in their memory, but to honor his part in creating the 3 miracles who will call me father." Tears sprang to Eleanor's eyes at this unexpected generosity of spirit. "You're an extraordinary man, Mason Blackwell. Just a man who understands that love multiplies rather than divides," he replied, echoing their earlier conversation. "Their hearts have room for both of us, in different ways. As winter gradually yielded to early spring, preparations for both the wedding and the ranch's busy season accelerated. Mason was often away during daylight hours, managing the multiple demands of calving season. But evenings found the family together before the hearth, a pattern of domesticity that felt increasingly natural. On a surprisingly mild March afternoon, Eleanor stood at the edge of Catherine's hot spring, watching as tender green shoots pushed through the earth surrounding the warm water. Mason had brought her here on horseback, the triplets securely bundled in special carriers he'd designed. For Thunder's saddle, first signs of spring, he observed, settling Benjamin on a blanket spread over dry ground. Always begin here before anywhere else on the ranch. Eleanor arranged Charlotte and Abigail beside their brother, marveling at how the once tiny infants now reached eagerly for the colorful stones that lined the spring's edge. "Careful," Mason cautioned, intercepting Abigail's determined crawl toward the water. "You've got your mother's adventurous spirit, little one." Eleanor laughed, watching him redirect the baby with gentle efficiency. "They adore you already. Benjamin lights up whenever you enter the room." "Mutual admiration," Mason replied, helping Charlotte sit upright. "Though I'm still learning, never expected fatherhood to arrive in triplicate." "You're a natural," Eleanor assured him, settling beside the family tableau. The scene before her, Mason surrounded by her children, all four bathed in spring sunshine, filled her heart to overflowing. "I brought you here for a reason today," Mason said, reaching into his pocket. Besides introducing the little ones to their first spring, he withdrew a small wooden box carved with intricate wildflowers. "This was meant to be a wedding gift, but I couldn't wait." Eleanor accepted the box, marveling at the craftsmanship of the delicate blooms. Inside, nestled on soft cloth, lay a gold locket bearing 3 small gemstones, a diamond flanked by sapphires. "Open it," Mason encouraged softly. The locket contained a tiny family portrait on one side, Daniel holding Eleanor's hand, the image carefully preserved from a photograph she'd brought west. The opposite side was empty. "For our wedding portrait," Mason explained, watching her expression, "so you can carry both loves close to your heart, always." The thoughtfulness of the gift, honoring her past while celebrating their future, moved Eleanor deeply. "It's perfect," she whispered, eyes shining with tears. "Exactly right." Mason helped her fasten the locket around her neck, his fingers brushing her skin with tender care. "Our story began in winter's darkest hour," he said, his voice low with emotion. "But it will continue through all seasons, Eleanor. That's my promise to you and these children." Benjamin chose that moment to attempt standing, using Mason's arm for support, his tiny face determined. When he succeeded for a wobbly moment, his delighted laugh rang out across the spring, echoed immediately by his sister's excited babbling. "They approve," Eleanor smiled, leaning against Mason's shoulder as they watched the triplets explore their surroundings with growing confidence. "Smart children," Mason replied, slipping his arm around her waist, "already recognize the home when they see it." As the afternoon sun bathed the sheltered valley in golden light, Eleanor surveyed the scene with quiet joy. Her journey had begun in grief and desperate necessity, nearly ended in tragedy, yet somehow led to this moment of perfect contentment. The blizzard that had threatened their lives had ultimately delivered them to safety more profound than mere physical shelter. In just 2 weeks, she would stand before Judge Wilson and promise herself to Mason Blackwell, formalizing the bond that had been growing since that first night when he carried her and her children through the snow. The ranch would become officially theirs, not just a temporary haven, but a permanent home where 3 children would grow strong under Montana skies. "Penny for your thoughts," Mason murmured, noting her contemplative expression. Eleanor smiled, watching as Charlotte discovered a spring wildflower pushing through the earth. "I was thinking about paths," she said. "How the one I feared would destroy us ultimately led exactly where we needed to be." Mason nodded, his eyes on the children who would soon be his by law as well as love. "That's frontier wisdom at its core," he observed. "Sometimes the harshest trails lead to the most beautiful destinations." Benjamin tottered toward them, managing 3 independent steps before Mason caught him as he tumbled forward. The little boy's triumphant expression suggested he considered this a monumental achievement rather than a near fall. "Already pioneering new territory," Mason laughed, settling the boy on his knee. Just like his mother, Eleanor gathered her daughters close, forming a family circle in the spring sunshine. The locket rested warm against her skin, a tangible reminder that love transcended even death's boundaries. Daniel would always remain part of their story, honored in memory and in the 3 children who carried his legacy forward. But the future, bright with promise despite its inevitable challenges, belonged to the family they were building together. A family born in a blizzard's fury, nurtured through a winter of transformation, and now blossoming with the strength of the Montana spring. "I love you," Eleanor said simply, the words carrying the weight of all they'd overcome and all they would. Faced together, Mason's smile held the certainty of a man who had found his true north after years of wandering. "And I love you, Eleanor Reed, soon to be Eleanor Blackwell, mother of my children, keeper of my heart, partner in all seasons to come." As if understanding the significance of the moment, the triplets fell quiet, their small faces solemn in the golden light. Then Abigail reached for Mason's beard. Charlotte patted Eleanor's cheek, and Benjamin produced his newest sound, a bubbling attempt at papa that brought tears to Mason's eyes. The ranch stretched around them, 5,000 acres of challenge and opportunity. Beyond it lay the Reed Land Grant, another 5,000 acres that would one day belong to 3 children born in Pennsylvania, but destined to thrive in Montana territory. Together, these lands represented not merely property, but a legacy of resilience, the tangible result of lives rebuilt after devastating loss. As they gathered the children and prepared to return to the ranch house, Eleanor took one last look at the spring, where new life pushed through winter-hardened ground. The symbolism wasn't lost on her. How appropriate that Mason had brought them here today, to this place where growth defied the harshest conditions. "Ready to head home?" Mason asked, settling Charlotte in her carrier. Eleanor nodded, lifting Abigail, while Mason secured Benjamin. "Yes," she replied with simple certainty. "I'm ready for home." The word encompassed far more than the ranch house waiting beyond the ridge. It embraced the man beside her, the children they would raise together, and the life they would build, on foundations of mutual respect and hard-won wisdom. Home, Eleanor realized as they rode back toward the ranch, wasn't a place at all. It was the certainty that wherever this family journeyed together, through whatever storms might come, they would face it with the same courage and commitment that had brought them through that first desperate blizzard. And in that knowledge, she found a peace beyond anything she could have imagined on that snowy night when a stranger appeared at her broken-down wagon and changed the course of her life forever. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.